McMaster, and he's going to be speaking to us about animalistic Gentiles according to followers of Jesus.
As you can see, the title of the paper has changed as the handout goes around.
One more. Do you have a handout?
I do have a handout, yeah. I printed off 30, so there's probably 10 too many. All right. The thesis of this paper is simple, maybe even simplistic. Modern Christian interpreters frequently claim that ancient Jews depicted Gentiles as impure animals, in particular as dogs. You have this nice quotation here from, well, you have a quotation, let's not call it nice, from the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, which has this to say: dog is a common term to express Jewish contempt for other peoples. This assertion is almost always wedded to a larger narrative of Christian origins, one that portrays Judaism to be a religion marked by particularism, exclusivism, and ethnocentrism, and thus inferior to the universalistic religion of Christianity. I think here most particularly of what's often referred to as the new perspective on Paul, very common at least in North American circles. J.Z. Smith, since Al already mentioned him, I'll bring him up as well. He also talks about this in discussions of early Christian, scholarship on early Christianity, and so does Tomoku Masuzawa in her book, The Invention of Western Religions. Contrary to these claims, though, the limited evidence that we have suggests that this imagery was actually most frequently used by followers of Jesus, and was done so in the context of a mission to non-Jews. In this paper, I will, or I intend, or hope to show that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and Paul, authors who modern scholars almost always characterize as inclusivistic thinkers, deploy impure animal imagery in relation to Gentiles, and thereby undermine the narratives of many modern Christian interpreters whose work can best be characterized as theological apologetics and not critical historical scholarship. Although Paul is the earliest writer amongst the four I will discuss, I choose to end with him because his use of animal language is least clear and therefore most contested. Instead, I will begin with the later gospel literature and will treat it based on the assumption of Markan priority. Whether Luke knows Matthew, I don't know. I'm beginning to think so, and it bothers me. But that doesn't matter for this paper. The Gospel of Mark portrays Jesus' encounter with a Gentile woman of Syro-Phoenician descent, whose daughter is possessed by a demon, by what Mark frequently calls a polluting or impure pneuma. The woman approaches Jesus, begging that he cast out the demon from her daughter, something that he has previously done for others in Mark's Gospel. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different times from what I see here. Jesus' response to the woman is striking. He states, you have this on your handout, "Permit the children to be fed fully first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Clearly, these words relate to the woman's ethnic descent, something Mark stresses. She's Greek. Specifically, her ethnicity marks her as Syro-Phoenician. Of this response, Joseph Klausner, who I've heard a lot about in the last week, the Jewish scholar of New Testament, concluded, I think these words are fantastic, Jesus' answer was so brusque and chauvinistic that if any other Jewish teacher of the time had said such a thing, Christians would never have forgiven Judaism for it. Michael and I were talking about the famous, the prayer that apparently your kids are required to say in school these days. Thank you for not making me a woman, and then thank you for not making me a Gentile, and how Christian scholars always bring this up, especially in relationship to Paul and his claim in Galatians 3:28 that in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, yada, yada, yada. So Klausner is right. Christian scholars will not let Jews forget these things, but they forget this when Jesus says it, or they do other things, as we're about to see. Depends which Jew says it, I guess. As Gerd Thiessen, not Thiessen, remarks, Jesus' initial response is morally offensive. It is as if a doctor would refuse to treat a foreign child. The ethnocentricity implied by Jesus' words are indeed harsh to modern ears, leading some to wonder how Jesus of all people could have uttered them. Consequently, some have sought to defend Jesus against the apparent ethnocentrism of this saying, claiming that Jesus' body language or tone of voice, I kid you not, would have shown the woman that he was only joking. Perhaps Jesus winked. Or perhaps he spoke with a comical voice, hinting at some ironical meaning to his words. The commentaries are just like full of this nonsense. Yeah, it's maybe the rabbis used a comical voice or winked when they said certain things too. Who knows? Historical Jesus scholars frequently conclude that this ethnic slur against the Gentile woman must have originated from the lips of Jesus, since it is difficult for them to conceive of a reason why early Christ followers would have invented such a saying. The criterion of embarrassment suggests that here we have an historical saying of Jesus, not a later creation by his followers, so goes the argument, who presumably were interested in a mission to the Gentiles. Mark, for instance, claims that Jesus predicted that the gospel would go to all nations or even Gentiles, Pantata ethne, in Mark 13:10. So it is hard to fathom why he would create a saying that insulted Gentiles in such a way. Of course, the criterion of embarrassment must still deal with one slight problem, right? Its own embarrassment, frankly. If it's implausible to conclude that Mark created this saying because it was too embarrassing for his own open attitude toward Gentiles, then surely it's almost as implausible that Mark would recount this saying at all. Yet, of course, he does. And the same can be said for Matthew. Matthew uses Mark, and he freely edits Mark's account of Jesus, very liberally at times. For instance, Matthew removes all of Mark's references to an angry Jesus. Mark 1:41-5, 10:14. For instance, Matthew omits this anger language. Another example. Mark's gospel contains a story in which Jesus uses spit in order to heal the blind man of Bethsaida, Mark 8:22-26. Matthew simply omits the story, presumably because he found it to be a source of embarrassment. Perhaps like Rabbi Akiva, according to the Tosefta Sanhedrin 12:10, Matthew thought such actions reeked of magic. Hit the delete button. Surely, given his editorial practices, Matthew would have done away with Jesus' calling of a Gentile woman a dog had he found it embarrassing. He didn't. Or he forgot to hit delete. After all, Matthew explicitly places the beginnings of the mission to the Gentiles on Jesus' lips at the end of his gospel. Go, therefore, make disciples of all the nations, or again, of all the Gentiles, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the sacred pneuma. Matthew 28:19. Instead, Matthew's Jesus makes even more apparent the ethnic reasoning behind the words of Mark's Jesus. Not only does he call her a dog, he says, I was sent only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, Matthew 15:24. Whereas in Mark, the children represent Israel and the dog represents this Gentile woman, Matthew adds a corresponding animal. Sheep, a pure, sacrificial animal, represents Israel. Presumably even rebellious Israelites or Jews. A dog represents Gentiles. Even a Gentile who comes to Jesus begging for scraps. Additionally, Matthew identifies the woman with a Canaanite, one of the more historically problematic types of non-Jews in Jewish thinking. Matthew, therefore, does not seem to be embarrassed by this statement. Rather, he finds it eminently useful for illustrating his ethnic reasoning for the priority of Israel over the Gentiles. Jesus was sent to preach and minister to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, not to treat dogs. Scholars often conclude that Mark was Jewish, but writing for Gentile followers of Christ. And they virtually always conclude that Matthew was Jewish and was writing for Jewish followers of Christ. When we turn to the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, those scholars frequently conclude that the author of these works was a Gentile who wrote for Gentile followers of Christ. At first glance, I think that's wrong, but that's another paper. At first glance, such a hypothesis seems to fit quite nicely with what Luke does with this harsh statement about Gentiles. Luke hits the lead. Luke's gospel lacks the story entirely. Surely Luke's omission of the story shows that he, at least, had the good sense to be embarrassed by a saying that equated Gentiles with dogs. Surely here we finally get to see the evidence that Christ followers were not ethnocentric and particularistic like Jews, Judaism. Perhaps we can concede that Mark, who if his Greek skills are any indication, was a bit of an undereducated barbarian, and Matthew, who was still constrained by his Jewish background, were unable to break the bonds of ethnocentrism. But the purportedly Gentile Luke moves the early Christ movement forward into becoming an inclusivistic religion free from the constraints of ethnic reasoning. Unfortunately, or at least unfortunately for those wanting Christianity to be free of ethnic reasoning, Luke simply does not fit this description. To be sure, Luke omits the story of Jesus calling a Gentile woman a dog, but he hits delete on a large section, the great omission, Mark 6:47 through 8:27a. In fact, maybe he doesn't even hit delete. Maybe he copies and pastes and then rearranges. Michael Pettum has made the compelling argument that Luke's omission of this material in his gospel occurs strategically. Luke intends to delay dealing with this material so that it better fits his chronological account of the spread of the gospel beyond the boundaries of Israel. And for that, he needs a second volume, Acts. Luke focuses on the question of the relationship of Gentiles to the gospel about Jesus in the story of Cornelius in Acts 10. And guess what pops up there? A bunch of impure animals. Here, Peter sees a vision of various animals and a heavenly voice commanding him to kill and eat what he sees. He sees it 3 times. That these animals are impure is suggested by the fact that Peter responds saying that he has never eaten anything koinos or a kathartos. This is Acts 10:14, and then it's repeated, actually, the same language of impurity. This vision occurs within the context of the conversion of Cornelius, a pious Gentile, demonstrating that it relates to anthropology, not diet. Luke uses animals to discuss Gentiles because, in the words of Claude Lévi-Strauss, animals are good to think with. The impure animals that Peter sees represent the Gentiles and their incorporation into this community shaped by the gospel. Peter's vision of these various animals in Acts 10 demonstrates that Luke holds to what anthropologists and sociologists refer to as an essentialist or essentializing view of Gentile identity. Gentiles are Gentiles because they are born that way. There is something innate to Gentile identity. Just as unclean animals are genealogically impure and not impure due to immorality or ritual impurity, so too Luke thinks that Gentiles used to be impure from birth and by nature. In other words, Gentile identity was not the result of behavior. Cornelius was, after all, very pious, very devout towards God, and gave alms to humans in need. Very pious and praised by the Jewish community, according to Acts 10. Nonetheless, he was impure in the same way that a dog or any other unclean animal was, born and bred. Only a new act on the part of the God of Israel could, so to speak, rewrite Gentile DNA, so that what was formerly impure could become truly pure. In portraying Gentiles as impure animals, these 3 writers, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and Jesus, if the saying in Mark and Matthew goes back to Jesus, demonstrate an essentializing understanding of Gentile identity. There is an essence to Gentile identity that truly, really, and naturally inheres in Gentiles and fundamentally distinguishes them from Jews. They are akin to impure animals and therefore are by nature unfit for incorporation. In Mark and Matthew, the woman concedes that her rightful place is under the table, not seated amongst the children. Still, she points out that nature itself shows that dogs are fed from the scraps. The woman remains a dog in the story. She does not become human or a sheep, but she still benefits. The same can be said for Luke's account. Cornelius and subsequent Gentiles who enter into this movement remain Gentiles, and consequently are not to keep those aspects of the Jewish law that pertain only to the Jews. Yet while they were formerly impure animals, they have now become purified, as God repeatedly tells Peter. Israel's God has purified them. God has rewritten the DNA of these impure animals so that now, being pure, they become receptacles for the sacred pneuma, which enters into them upon hearing Peter's gospel proclamation. But what about Paul? F.C. Bauer, actually perhaps the first proponent of the new perspective, so talk about new, I don't know. F.C. Bauer averred long ago that in his writings, Paul intended to, and I quote, I think you have this on your handout, to remove the last remnants of Jewish particularism. Paul too uses dog language in his letter to the Philippians. Here many interpreters believe that Paul has taken the particularistic language of his fellow Jews and turned it against them. This is an old reading. It goes back to Chrysostom. But whom does he style dogs, Chrysostom asks in Philippians 3:2. His answer, there were at this place some of those whom he hints at in all his epistles, base and contemptible Jews, gritty of vile lucre and fond of power, who desiring to draw aside many of the faithful, preached both Christianity and Judaism at the same time, corrupting the gospel. As then they were not easily discernible, therefore he says, beware of the dogs. The Jews are no longer children, Chrysostom claims. Once the Gentiles were called dogs, but now the Jews. The tables have been turned. And now the Jews find themselves on the wrong side of the kosher system, right? According to Chrysostom. Yet in a recent article, Mark Nanos challenges this scholarly consensus, arguing that it was not, in fact, common for Jews to refer to Gentiles as dogs, at least not common prior to the rise of the early Jesus movement. Nanos' article rightly notes that while passages from the Hebrew Bible can refer to certain Gentiles as dogs, for instance, 1 Samuel 17:43, 2 Kings 8:13, other passages use the same word, dog, to refer to Israelites. 1 Samuel 24:14, 2 Samuel 3:8, 9:8, 16:9. Deuteronomistic history, apparently. In other words, Jewish scriptures do not systematically refer to Gentiles with either dog language or, more broadly, impure animal language. I suggest that we must place Paul's reference to dogs within the same context as that of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, a mission to Gentiles. But rather than seeing Paul here referring to Jews as dogs, I think, I'm not alone, but I'm in a minority, I think Paul refers here to a group of rival missionaries who are themselves non-Jews. The problem with determining the historical reference behind Paul's various epithets here, of course, is that we simply do not actually know with any certainty their identity. We must perform what John Barclay has referred to as a mirror reading of Paul's letters. In the case of Philippians, I believe that there is good reason to conclude that Paul's opponents are a group of Judaizing Gentiles who have become convinced that circumcision and adoption of the Jewish law fundamentally changes Gentile identity. They believe that they have become Jews through observance of such works of the law. Paul, in contrast, and I think he does the same thing in Romans and in Galatians, concludes that such works of the law help Gentiles in no way, leaving them self-deceived Gentiles. In Paul's own words, they remain dogs, but now in sheep's clothing. These workers of the law, ironically, Paul considers to be evil workers, and their circumcision and message about the need for Gentiles to undergo circumcision, he considers a mere mutilation, katatome, says in Philippians 3:2. While the noun katatome does not appear elsewhere in the Septuagint, in the New Testament, or early Jewish literature, related verb katatemno does occur 4 times in the Septuagint and refers to forbidden ritualistic practices of cutting. Most scholars believe that Paul here demeans circumcision, but this is unlikely. As Marcus Bockmuehl observes, Paul never spoke out against circumcision in law observance on the part of Jews. Indeed, he thought it valuable, Romans 3:1, and encouraged Jews to continue in it after they came to faith in Christ, 1 Corinthians 7:18. Circumcision was not for Jews incompatible with faith in Christ, according to Romans 4:12, at least. Paul does not criticize circumcision in general, rather he criticizes Gentile circumcision. He is a missionary to Gentiles, and he's got a bee in his bonnet over Gentiles undergoing circumcision. Paul calls these Gentile Judaizers dogs. Their circumcision in law observance has not overcome their genealogical deficiencies as Gentiles. A dog is a dog. Their works of the law amount to evil works, and their circumcision amounts to nothing more than genital mutilation. In contrast, Paul stresses his own Jewish credentials, acknowledging that if anyone has reason to boast, it's him. He claims, "We are the circumcision." Most scholars take the pronoun "we" here to refer to all who believe in Christ, thereby claiming that all followers of Christ, Jews and Gentiles, are the circumcision. Although it's grammatically possible that Paul refers to himself and his readers, another possibility, seldom discussed, also exists, that the "we" Paul refers to are himself and Timothy, that is, those writing to the Philippians. It's an authorial "we." Consequently, Paul contrasts himself and Timothy to these opponents who are on the Philippian horizon. We, not these people, are the circumcision. Since Paul's very next use of the first-person plural pronoun refers to himself or himself and Timothy in Philippians 3:17, I am convinced that the "we" of 3:3 does not include the letter's recipients, but only its author or authors. Second, nowhere else does Paul refer to Gentile Christ followers as the circumcision. In fact, as Joel Marcus has shown quite nicely, in Pauline communities the term circumcision was used as a reference for Jews, whereas the term foreskin gets used for Gentiles. And Paul preaches the gospel of foreskin. Peter preaches the gospel of circumcision. He preaches to Jews. Paul and perhaps his co-authors are the circumcision, that is, they are Jews in contrast to his opponents. And implied in that is that they're not actually Jews. Oh, okay. I need to speed it up a little bit. Paul continues to stress the aspect of his Jewish identity that he inherited. I'm kidding. Including the fact that he was circumcised on the 8th day after his birth. Given the obviousness of the timing of Paul's circumcision, why would Paul feel it important to mention here? I suggest that Paul intends to contrast his own covenantal circumcision on the 8th day after birth, in accordance with Genesis 17 and Leviticus 12, with the later circumcisions of his opponents, who were not circumcised on the 8th day after their births, precisely because they weren't born to Jewish parents. In doing so, Paul emphasizes that his circumcision is lawful. I have a few passages on the handout, I believe. Nope. A few early Christian interpreters note this aspect of Paul's rhetoric. Ambrosiaster, the interpreter known as Ambrosiaster, Chrysostom, Theodoret, all point out that Paul's emphasis on 8th day circumcision is to stress that he's not a proselyte. He's a Jew born and bred. In other words, it works really nicely if his opponents are proselytes, I think. I'm going to skip past some of this, unfortunately. I'm going to skip to here just to make sure I get done. As I noted previously, Mark Nanos has argued that there is no evidence that early Jews called Gentiles dogs. While I understand and sympathize with Nanos' concern for the way in which Christian interpreters often continue to stereotype Jews negatively, I think his conclusion is ultimately unsound. After all, Mark, Matthew, Paul, and even, I am convinced, Luke were Jews, and Jesus, if Jesus said these words that we mentioned at the beginning. And while these thinkers were all Jews who believed in Jesus, I think they fit within a broader, but far from universal, stream of thought that emphasized the genealogical gap between Jews and non-Jews, using the language of animals, pure and impure. Perhaps most powerfully, The animal apocalypse, now preserved in 1 Enoch 85 through 90, consistently portrays the Sethite and Shemite lines as bulls and Israelites as sheep, and all the other nations as various impure animals, usually violent impure animals. Simply put, the work systematically distinguishes between Israel and the nations genetically or genealogically. Israel is ontologically different from the rest of humanity. What is fascinating about the animal apocalypse, though, is that even as it emphasizes the genealogical and seemingly irreconcilable distance between Jews and non-Jews, what can a dog do at the end of the day? It can't become a sheep. It envisages God's inclusion of Gentiles as Gentiles in God's salvation at the culmination of human history. And you have part of this. I should have put more on in 1 Enoch 90, 37 through 38. At the end of human history, God transforms Gentiles not into sheep, not into Jews or Israelites, but into white bulls. Adamic, maybe even Abrahamic, but not Israelite. This transformation restores the Gentiles to the status of pure animals without turning them into Jews or sheep. What I think Mark, Matthew, Luke, Paul, and the author of the animal apocalypse, and possibly Jesus, all share in common is what, in relation to the thought of Paul, Chris Hayes has helpfully termed an exclusivistic view of Gentile inclusion. Gentiles are caught up in God's salvation, but they can only do so as Gentiles, not Jews. This is what the animal imagery in these New Testament writers suggests. An unchangeable ontological distinction between Jews and Gentiles that strikes many modern readers as exclusivistic, when it should actually strike us as both remarkably inclusivistic and exclusivistic. Difference is acknowledged as real, persistent, and even divinely ordained. Yet Israel's God incorporates and therefore eternalizes that difference at the end of the world and into the world to come. Thank you.
One of our organizers talked longer than expected.
I apologize.
But
That's a license for us.
Uta's not here, so I thought I could take a minute or two.
I'm thankful for this wonderful paper. We've had a strong start. I open the floor for questions.
So, Matt,
Yeah.
so Paul famously fails to follow through on equality between men and women. So we have the famous line from Galatians 3:28,
Right.
and then it doesn't seem to have occurred to him that women should be treated as equals.
Yeah.
Would you say that actually that it's consistent, and the same thing would apply in his churches with Jews and Gentiles, and that there's unity but not dissolution of identity, and that women are still women and Gentiles are still dogs?
Yeah. So, yes, period. So the Philippian stuff, I was reading this morning and I thought, man, maybe I should have gone somewhere else with Paul. But I really want to do the dog stuff in Philippians 3. A place where it's clearly apparent in Paul, just redundant, is Romans 11. In the olive tree, where we have the natural olive tree and olive branches, or cultivated, I should say, olive tree, which represents Israel, and Jews who believe and Jews who don't believe are still cultivated. And the wild olive branches represent Gentiles. And even after they're grafted into the cultivated tree, they remain wild.
I'm going to talk about that passage tomorrow, so stop talking about it.
Let me go on. No. So in other words, I think Paul is clear that he essentializes these identities and they don't get erased in the gospel. Galatians 3:28 is a nice soundbite, but I don't think it's intended to erase difference. It's Carolyn Johnson Hodge talks about nested identities, and I think that's right. Paul's saying Christ is the most important. He trumps these other aspects of identity, but they still persist.
No, I was just going to say it's so important not to leave out the part of those declarations that begins in Christ.
Yes.
Okay, in Christ, all of these things. But we're living here on the earth. And so all of those are always predicated. When it comes to faith, everyone is the same in terms of faith. But that has nothing to do with the observances and the expectations and the social delineations and the rights and the privileges that attach to certain ontological statuses that, as you know, I'm entirely sympathetic to this argument, that, you know, I think Paul was an exclusivist and really did see these as fixed identities that simply couldn't be transferred. I was also interested, though, in, and I think it's a real contribution, too, and lines up, I think, with Al's paper, when you make this distinction in the linguistic choices of Paul and Peter, distinguishing circumcision from essentially what's genital mutilation when it's done by a Gentile, right? The same act, but for one, precisely because it is not open to you as a way to, as an entree into the covenant, then it's simply genital mutilation. But for those for whom it's commanded happening on the 8th day, then it is actual circumcision and a sign of the covenant. So that's very similar. It's a way of, because he's speaking to a Gentile audience, he adopts the language of the Gentile audience, because we know that this is how Gentiles referred to circumcision. They saw this as genital mutilation. They couldn't understand why Jews did this. And so he's very good at capturing that language and confirming their own sense of, you know, you're right. You don't want to do this. You don't want to join us. He himself, this is a mask, right? He himself believes that it's circumcision and it's what Jews need to do. But you call it genital mutilation? Good. I'm glad you do, because I don't want you to do it. I don't think you can do it. It is for you nothing but genital mutilation. So it's a way of sort of, again, co-opting language to affect something that needs to be affected. And as you know, I've argued he does that on other grounds too. He co-opts language to sell something to the Gentiles that he himself doesn't actually believe. So,
two things. The in Christ stuff, I mean, even that is both gendered and ethnic. Because in Christ means you're in a male and you're in a Jew. John Levinson has this great, in his Inheriting Abraham book, has this great discussion of Paul that if you're looking for a universalist, look elsewhere. And I think that's exactly right. And this is what really bothers me about the rhetoric of a lot of New Testament scholarship, that it paints Paul in a way that I think is unhistorical, anti-historical, and really is theological apologetics at the end of the day, and bad at that. So, Philippians 3, you know, I was thinking, I wish Paul would call it sacrilege, but that's more of a Jewish, maybe. I mean, no, it's a Greek thing as well, but. Were a lay Jew to go up and to take, you know, the high priestly garments on, that might seem to an outsider like a very pious thing, but it's sacrilege. It's taking something that God did not give to you and doing it. And the same action done by someone else becomes sacrilege or mutilation, a mutilation of a right.
I mean, although in the case of the encroacher, sacrilege is profanation, right? Taking something holy and treating it as unholy because you don't have access to it. So it is truly a profanation. But circumcision, it's not taking something holy and making it unholy, so he can't really use that term. And I think he really has to use a genital.
You might be right. So Sabbath. It was when Gentiles adopt Sabbath, you can talk about that as profanation. And some rabbinic texts do, I think.
The other thing is, if Jews were so busy calling Gentiles dogs, you would think we would see more of that in rabbinic literature. And to the best of my knowledge, and of course Gentiles do get equated with animals, it tends to happen more often as you move later and in the Babylonian Talmud. But the favorite is donkeys, and it's exegetically based. It's based on a verse in Ezekiel, which is often translated as referring to Gentiles, and it refers to donkeys and the flesh of donkeys. So that seems to be the go-to term.
Interesting.
As donkeys.
While we were talking, I just opened. There is some stuff. There's the Yerushalmi, when you're supposed to do with the Avodah Zarah, every time you see Avodah Zarah, play along with the name, and instead of saying Pnei Eloha, the face of the God, call it the Pnei Kelev, so the God, their God is equated to a
I'm
dog.
not sure that I don't think they are some, and Persians are bears. I don't know, I don't. There are animal terms, but dogs isn't really one of them for Gentiles themselves. Occasionally, but
so I'm saying, I ran the things. No, but I actually want to support you.
No,
I want to say that it's not for the Gentiles, it's for their God.
Yeah,
exactly.
I understand that. So you would expect more of that if it was.
So Al and then
three completely disconnected comments.
All right.
It had nothing to do with each other. First of all, in the discussion about, in the discussion about the olive tree,
Yeah.
I just want to make a very small agricultural point, which I think is well known, but just needs to be stated. The wild olive branches grafted onto the stock of the cultivated olive tree will never give you olives and will never give you oil.
I didn't know that.
Me neither.
I didn't know.
What? And that just shows that this is a completely wasted, useless, unproductive operation. No, I'm quite serious.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, that's number one. Number two, in response to Chris's comment about donkeys, I always thought it was Shulachem Poim HaChamor in Genesis. That was the beginning of that. When Abraham tells his servants to sit with the donkey. And that was, what? Yeah, that's right. That was where I thought it came from.
Because there's a couple.
What?
There's a couple different ones.
Okay, all right, that's, anyway. And the last point is about the word peritomē.
Yeah.
Could you just repeat what you said about the history of the word peritomē? Because I found it in a text that is pretty much well, maybe a century later than Paul, referring to circumcision. It's in a text that I'm the only person in this room, I think, who knows it. It's in Philo of Biblos. Not the Philo that we all know, but the Philo about whom I wrote my PhD. But he talks there about peritomē as an operation on one's genitals that was introduced at a time of crisis as a kind of substitute for child sacrifice.
Right. Yeah.
And who's doing, he says who's doing this? Sorry.
What?
What's the context? He's talking
Philo
about
of Biblos
who?
talked about circumcision as a ritual introduced at a time of crisis as a substitute for child sacrifice, which otherwise would have been required at a time of great crisis. But he's there. Philo of Biblos is someplace, let's say, 2 generations or so, depending on just when you date him, a generation or 2 generations after Paul, and he has the term peritomē. It means that this was a word that would have been meaningful to the larger audience. It would not have struck them as strange.
Right.
I think that's the point I want to make.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I said about peritomē. I talked about katomē.
Yeah.
So in Pauline communities, maybe this is what led you to think about Philo of Biblos. Joel Marcus notes that this language of circumcision, uncircumcision, circumcision, foreskin, it actually is used of Jews or Gentiles in Pauline communities. So I'm not sure if that's what you're thinking of, but I'll have to look at that Philo passage.
Yeah.
Thanks.
There's a good book on Philo of Biblos that I happen to write.
Yeah, first, thank you so much for your paper. I found it extremely interesting. It gave me a lot to think about. I enjoyed it very much. And I just had a very small suggestion following what Chris said. I'm very convinced what you say about the identity of Paul's opponents, that they were not native Jews.
Yeah.
He suggests they were proselytes, so I don't know exactly how he used the term, but you mean proselytes converted to Judaism?
Yes.
Well, I think it would make your point even stronger and make the text even more meaningful if you would consider them just to be Gentile Christians who Judaize to the point that they get themselves circumcised. Meaning, it's not that they first converted to Judaism and then became followers of Christ, whatever. They did not go a kind of rabbinic conversion or whatever, Jewish conversion. You know, they converted to Christianity, to the message of whoever, and they started to want to practice Jewish practices and they circumcised themselves. And in this context, mutilation makes even more sense because then there is really no covenant. There is no connection with Israel. You understand what I mean?
So they're Jesus followers.
Could I add something to what you're saying? The question is, at what point does genital mutilation become a crime that's potentially punishable by the government, in which case calling it genital mutilation means that you are effectively saying to your audience, this is a criminal action for which you can be prosecuted. I don't know the history of the criminal aspect of genital mutilation, but I think it's worth looking into to see whether or not there's also that aspect to discussing this as genital mutilation.
To the best of my knowledge, it's later.
I think
the issue is really criminal, but still, I mean,
But it's still
it's a
socially
Roman
and
colony.
it's still socially and ideologically, something that is.
And because it was a Roman colony, and they did not look at operations on genitals in a very positive way in general.
It was also, I probably would guess, also very likely fatal, because you would get a very bad infection, and that it would almost certainly kill you. So that's another side.
We don't have time. No more time. Thank you very much. We will now go together to the bus.